Welcome to the Rock Newman Show.
It's the Rock Newman Show.
Thank you for joining us. And without any further ado, let me go to Brian Yeldell. Brian Yeldell, welcome to the Rock Newman Show.
Thank you very much, Rock.
Brian, you are an author. You are really a consultant. You are a filmmaker. You are an entrepreneur. So we just simply don't have time to get into all of those things. But part of what I wanted to do, you have a fascinating book out. Folks, the name of Brian Yeldell's book is Notions and Potions. And it is the writings and the musings of a long-time Washington, D.C. native, someone whose heritage is steeped in Washington, D.C. and Washington, D.C. politics. Brian Yeldell's uncle, amongst many in his other family, but Joseph Yeldell was certainly a powerhouse in Washington, D.C. politics for decades. Joe Yeldell was often known as the fixer, for those of you who might not know, because if there was a problem, folks turned to Joe Yeldell to fix it. And Brian is not far from the, hasn't fallen far from the tree of his uncle. So Brian, Notions and Potions, we could start anywhere in that book, but you make an interesting comment about memorable moments. You know, I just quoted a statistic about how many African Americans were being arrested in the District of Columbia, and that scenario where African Americans in urban areas are overwhelmingly arrested and portrayed in really negative ways. So it strikes me, and I want to start here, in your memorable moments in Notions and Potions, one of your moments that you talk about is the birth of your two daughters.
Yes. I say that because it is about the next generation. You know, I'm 50 now. I've done quite a bit in my life, from, you know, growing up in Southeast Washington, D.C., going off to Morehouse, and eventually getting my MBA. And working in banking, and you know, I really wanted to acquire a set of skills such that I could be a CEO, because I think when I look at my uncle's generation, it was about politics, and politics, the next thing is economic parity, and I wanted to pave the way for my daughters, to show them that they could go out and take a chance in entrepreneurial life. I talked about my corporate life briefly, but I worked at IBM. I also worked at Bank of America. I worked at Chase Manhattan. All very good grounding, but it was time for me to go out on my own. And one of the things I think that prompted you to reach out to me was my latest essay, which was called The Battle of the Brains. A person gets a set of skills such as your left brain skills, which are analytical, but you also have to call on your right brain sometime, which is the creative part, which is why I went out into entrepreneurial life. But going back to why I am an entrepreneur is to set the stage for the next generation. And for me, that's my daughters, my younger family members.
Okay. What I'd like to do, though, and I make no apologies for attempting to highlight this, you know, we talk about now, we hear so often on the news about the one-parent households, sure, you know, children being born out of wedlock, no father around or anything else. Brian Yeldell walked in with his beautiful little daughter, has two children. Again, in terms of a memorable moment in your book, Potions and Notions, okay, I'd like for you to go back and talk about that experience of fatherhood.
Quite frankly, it's not in my book, but I wrote an essay which spawned another book, which I plan to bring out next Father's Day. It's called Bye Bye Guy's Guy. Growing up, I hung out a lot, I had a lot of fun, but I had to put that life away in order to set an example for my daughters. So I would have to say that that particular essay is one that really just brings everything home as to transitioning from a single person to a married person to a person with two children and having to set an example. So it's that essay. While it's not in the book, it is definitely, when you said the moments, that's a moment definitely that comes to my mind, and it's called Bye Bye Guy's Guy. And I did spawn it into an entire book. Right now, the book is going to probably be about 16 chapters. a little over 300 pages, but it's all about the transition from being a single person who kind of hung out on these streets here, right here on U Street. I remember it going from the 80s, which is everything was down, and then building the Subway and Ben's Chili Bowl, trying to have, just to get a few customers. I've talked to the owners of Ben's to understand that transition and how vibrant this area is now. But I was one of those early, late 20s, early 30-something people when it made that transition. But as it relates to my daughters, that life is over. It's about building something for them. And that particular essay speaks to that.
And having lived the experience that you've lived, as you said, out there and having some fun and, having to take on a much greater sense of responsibility, what would be your message, not just to young black men, but young black men and women when they contemplate having a child?
Well, quite frankly, and I say quite frankly because I'm being more emphatic opposed to telling a truth versus an untruth. I probably wasn't ready. Mm-hmm. I thought that I could do both, but you really can't. So that would be my message to be ready and to understand that you have to devote your time to them. I find myself going to all kinds of things, having daughters. I thought I would have a couple of sons, and because I think we're going to get into the basketball piece, I love basketball. And while my daughters can appreciate basketball, if I had a little blue chipper, it'll be a different thing. But now I find myself going to recitals. I find myself going to, gymnastic events. I've even had a few tea parties. And again, going back to the whole name of my book, Guy's Guy, I was a guy's guy. Let's go to the bar. Mm-hmm. Let's go to football games, tailgate parties. But I've had to, reach into my softer side. And one of the things, again, I make no apologies about it, too, is my growing spirituality. And I know the Lord has a sense of humor. And me being that guy's guy, he gave me two little girls to touch into that.
Right. So, coming out of Morehouse, and condolences for not being able to make it at Howard University, because you had to go down to Morehouse. But that's okay. We won't hold that against you today.
Okay.
Coming through Morehouse, coming out into the corporate world,
sure.
You have gone from banking, from consulting, as an entrepreneur, and really started writing pieces that have insight into culture, into humanity, into spirituality. Tell us about that metamorphosis.
Again, going back to the MBA, an MBA kind of teaches you a top-down approach to business. I have an undergraduate degree in accounting. My MBA had a concentration in finance, and I started a marketing firm. I touched on all three areas of business, and I got involved with a media company. And one of the things that really started me writing as well is I sat there. I took my daughters down, not on the day of the inauguration in 2009, but the day before, because I thought it would be too busy.
Both of those days was cold.
Exactly, very cold and very busy. But I sat there that day and watched the inauguration, and I wrote an essay that talked about the fact that President Obama talked about a lot of things that we needed, but a poet and a minister talked about the fact that we're going to need some love too. And I want my daughters to always think about that. So that was my first essay. And then I wrote one the next week, and the next week, and I literally been writing them for 5 weeks. But another thing that started me...
For 5 years?
5 years,
yes.
Excuse me, yes, for 5 years. Mm-hmm. So I've written close to 250 essays. Mm-hmm. And one of the essays, when I started with the media company, I wrote an essay about basketball because I really wanted to eventually do a documentary. But I also really intensified my writing because having a media company, and while I do some of the business development for it, I also wanted to show people who had ideas, if they wanted to come in, they had an in-house writer who could write their story. Because typically, the name of the book was created because the title of the essay is the notion. The body of the essay is the potion. And I really, again, thinking about President Obama, I wanted to help in my way to solve some of the problems that I knew he would face, because if we all remember where the economy was and the fact that a lot of the Congress and not so much the Senate, but Congress wasn't getting along. So in my own little way, and in my own little world, my little, if you will, Washington, D.C., Morehouse community, UVA community, my fraternity community, shout out to Psi Chapter, Morehouse College, Omega Psi Phi, all of those communities, I wanted to be able to touch those people and be able to to have some words of uplift, and also kind of continue the message of sometimes healing.
Yeah. And what's been the response? What kind of feedback have you gotten? Folks, I am going to give this book a plug, not because I have any interest other than trying to help make the world a better place one conversation at a time. But, you know, this is not a highly heralded book, something that you see on the New York Seller Best Time list yet. But I'm going to strongly encourage you, get this book, Notions and Potions. It is a powerful, very interesting, compelling read.
Thank you very much, Rock. What was your question again? I'm sorry, I got caught up in you patting my back.
Yeah. No problem at all. No, my point was about the feedback that you've gotten.
Sure. Yeah. Well, quite frankly, I found that when I first started writing them, I got a lot of people writing me back. Oh, that was a good essay. One of my essays is called "Why We Love a Train Wreck," and I found that the world, you know, when everything's nice, they don't mention it. When there's a train wreck, it just, you know, people hop on it. And so right now, I write an essay every week. I have close to 4,000, or a little over 4,000 people on my distribution list. And when it's a hot, fairly controversial topic, I may get 120 responses. When it's kind of benign or innocent, I don't, you know, people just say, hey, but when I see people on the street who are on my distribution list, so I get a lot of positive feedback. I mean, every now and then, and it's funny, I go out literally and I collect them one at a time.
Sure.
And again, I started with approximately 300, maybe 500, because I used to be a promoter. And so I had a fair amount of people on my list, but it has grown from, you know, January of 2009 to 4,000 people.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break here on the Rock Newman Show. Come back, and man, I can't wait to get into how Washington, D.C. basketball changed the world.
Absolutely.
On the Rock Newman Show with Brian Yeldell.
This is Leprechaun Tim Pohanka from Pohanka Nissan and Pohanka Hyundai. It's hard to be down on your luck when you're Virginia's first choice for new Nissan and Hyundais, but I need to sell 60 cars this week. Right now, I'll pay you big bucks for your good luck. Bring down any good luck charm you've gotten based on the sale price of the car you choose. I'll give you up to $4,777 off any nicer, newer car this week. Today, your lucky penny is worth plenty, up to $4,777 off any nicer, newer car you want. Stop moping and hoping you'll get approved. With my For the People credit approval process, the banks are looking to get lucky and lend to you, even if you've been turned down before. Bring me any good luck charm and I'll give you up to $4,777 off any nicer, newer car today. Hurry, once I get rid of 60 cars, the luck runs out. All offers require bank approval, so call us at 1-800-POHANKA, visit Pohanka Nissan and Pohanka Hyundai on Route 1 in Fredericksburg, or better yet, log on to TimPohankaForThePeople.com. And when we make a deal, I promise it'll be your lucky day. I'm Tim Pohanka, and I'm a leprechaun for the people.
And now, the Rock Newman Show.
Welcome back, folks. My guest today, August the 3rd, 2013. This is Saturday, by the way, for those of you who might have had too much of a good time last night to realize what today is. It is Saturday morning, and we're at the Langston Hughes Room at Busboys and Poets in Washington, D.C., and my guest is Brian Yeldell. And we're talking, in the last segment, we talked about Brian's book, Notions and Potions. And I want to transition to this multifaceted gentleman here. Brian has been working in a collaboration to develop a documentary, and it's called, the documentary film will be called How DC Basketball Changed the World. Now, that is a very strong title. Just before we go into how DC basketball changed the world, let's kind of step back. Who's the best basketball player ever to come out of the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area?
Easy, Elgin Baylor. Easy.
Elgin Baylor.
Elgin Baylor. Just as a caveat, he started it, and no one's really. And one of the things that I think about is the fact that he took the game off the floor. They want to credit that with Dr. J, but he took the game off the floor when the NBA wanted to spread west. They needed a guy who had skill and who was marketable, and Elgin was the guy. And here's the real topper for me. I see these guys doing the things that they do, and some of them maybe a little bit better, a lot of them close, and some of them right on par. But I played basketball for a long time, and I know the difference between canvas shoes and leather shoes. And if you can do it with canvas shoes on concrete.
Chuck Taylors,
and sometimes Pro Kids. Certainly, I mean, that's what makes that statement so easy.
You know what? That's, I'm going to say profound, because you just really touched on something. You said it casually, but the National Basketball Association, one of the major league franchise leagues, wanted to go west, and you maintain that it was an Elgin Baylor who helped the NBA to expand west, that he had a very large impact on the success of that expansion. Absolutely.
And the fact that, you know, when I think about it, again, I've done quite a bit of study about this, and, you know, the game was started, and we can get into this with the documentary, but we talk about a gentleman by the name of E.B. Henderson.
Yes.
And E.B. Henderson was in Massachusetts, learned the game from Naismith, came back to D.C. and wanted to play at the Y, the Young Men's Christian Association, and they wouldn't allow him. So he went to Howard, and he went to Armstrong, he went to Dunbar, and a few of the high schools.
And this is what time period?
This is in the turn of the century,
yes.
turn of the 20th century.
Right.
And he was able to create a league, and he also he put physical education into the school system. But and so the game was largely on the East Coast and some of the other inner cities. But when they went to California, which was probably more baseball areas and track and field and swimming and volleyball, they got a guy like an Elgin Baylor. And one of the things that's not talked about as well is that he averaged over 35 points and over 15 rebounds for 3 straight seasons. And, I mean, that's just not done now. Some people will argue that it was a lot less competition, and maybe argue the fact that there were a lot less African Americans playing, which means that they didn't have – it was a lot more structured game at the time. But he took – inside of that structure, he was able to do that in a very creative way.
You know, it's very interesting you talk about that, because he played for a strict disciplinarian. Elgin Baylor played for a quick disciplinarian named Dave Brown, who is an absolute legend in terms of his coaching skills and the men that he grew during his tenure as coach and as teacher. Last week, I think it was, Glenn Harris was on here, and Dave Brown's name came up in that conversation. He was a gentleman who never, ever raised his voice, but he carried such a very big stick and had an impact on so many. You talk about Elgin Baylor, and Dave Brown certainly had impact there. Also, Dave Bing.
Sure.
Now, we'll come back to that in just a moment. When we talk about Elgin Baylor or Dave Bing, Spingarn High School graduates, and this is a Washington, D.C. based program here. and we're always concerned. We want to export DC culture to the rest of the world. But there's sort of pain in a lot of folks' heart as we talk about an Elgin Baylor and Dave being from Spingarn, that Spingarn is now being closed.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a tragedy. And as you say, and I'm pretty sure I'm correct in this, but that's of the top 50 players, that's the only school that has 2 players, and it is a tragedy. But, and I mean, I really don't know how to speak to that. I mean, other than the fact that it's a tragedy about Spingarn closing. I haven't studied it enough to know all of the facts and figures. But I mean, I'm a DC guy and love DC and like to keep all the traditions going.
Okay, so let's get into the basketball get a little bit. I still want to stay with some players here.
Okay, sure.
Before we talk about how the game and its players changed the world. So let's do this. Let's pick, because you've done the research. You've been a long-time student. Let's pick the top. Let's pick the top 5 players and make a team.
Okay, a team. Okay.
Now this is a team.
Okay.
So we need a center, we need 2 forwards, and we need 2 guards.
Oh wow, that's okay.
I wanted to make it difficult.
Okay, you did. I wish you had given me this question, but I'll start with because I want to put Adrian Danley is probably going to. Well, Adrian and
struggle.
Okay, just off the top of my head, I'm going to have to say Elgin.
So we have Elgin.
I'm going to put him at my even though
at the number 4 position.
I'm going to put him at the 4. I'm going to put Adrian Danley at the 3, even though he's a 3-4. I'm going to have to put
Adrian Danley. I mean, in case you guys don't know, Adrian Danley led the NBA in scoring many times. What, Taft Junior High?
Taft
Junior High, DeMatha High School.
Notre Dame.
Yeah, and then Notre Dame, and led the NBA in scoring multiple times.
At 6'5".
At 6'5", at best.
With elevated tennis shoes on.
Right.
I'm going to put, this is a tough one and a stretch. I'm going to put Len Bias at my 2 because he had strong enough 2 skills, even though he was a 3. But we're crowded at the 3. And Len Bias, I have to believe, would have been neck and neck with Michael Jordan. I mean, there are a lot of people who argue that, but and that's a tragedy in and of itself. And we speak to that, and we speak to at least 4 people who were pretty close to Len in our documentary, because obviously we can't get him. Point guard, man, I'm gonna have to come back to the bigs because we don't have a lot of bigs who've come out of this area. But who's my point guard? And I don't want to keep this going too long. Because he's a friend, I'm gonna have to go with Johnny Dawkins.
Johnny Dawkins over Austin Carr.
See, I got my 2 guard already filled. So Austin was a 2. But, man, I mean, we're filled. And this is the thing that we talk about in our documentary, is the fact that we have guys in D.C. I mean, and one of the things we do is juxtapose us against New York, because New York wants to claim that they are who they are. But New York guys they want to dribble. They want to take their time. D.C. guys want to get buckets. And we get buckets in big numbers. And there's a website, DC Basketball, which I write for, and it streams all the guys from DC who had more than 2,000 points in their college careers, and some of them are known and some of them aren't known. But
let me jump in here.
Okay, sure.
You talk about DC and New York.
Okay.
I remember there was a guy already 7'1".
Okay.
By the name of Lou Alcindor, who later became Kareem Abdul-Jabbar.
Right.
He played for Power Memorial in New York.
Sure.
Now, the producer of this show, sitting over there in the corner, is a guy from New York.
Okay.
They were unbeatable.
Sure.
And then they came up against DeMatha.
1965. Sure.
And got knocked off that perch.
Right.
By a DC team. I just want to say that with my New York friend sitting over in the corner.
Well, there are a few more stories like that. There was a team, I want to think they were on, I think it was on Long Island, and the Dunbar team from 1975 that had Stacey Robinson, another great basketball player. And they had a couple of guys, Wayne McCoy, who went on to greatness at St. John's, and they were number 1 in the country, and Dunbar went up there and beat them. So, I mean, there are a lot of stories like that. I mean, they come down, and God bless them. I love New York. I do. It's one of the best cities in the world, arguably the best city. But a lot of times they've come down here with their their hat in their hand after they left.
Okay, so this one maybe is a little, this is might not be as difficult as the first one. The best team from Washington, D.C. of all time, the best high school team, sort of what year and who made it up. I have my thoughts about that, but I want to hear yours first.
Well, it's funny you say that because one of the things that I know through my writing and getting away from basketball for a second, but most people romanticize about their era. My dad would have loved things from the 50s. I love things from the late 70s and early 80s. My nephew loves things from the. Getting back to your question.
But I'm talking about the greatest of all time.
Sure. Greatest. I saw that the Mather team in '81 that had Adrian Branch, Bob Ferry, Kelvin Johnson. Let me go back to. Man.
Let me.
Give me some suggestions.
I will give you a suggestion. Okay. 1969. I think it was 69. I think it was 69. The Ramblin' Wreck from McKinley Tech. Bassett, Bassard, Apple Milam.
That's right.
Kevin Ho. Bradshaw.
Bradshaw. Kevin Tatum.
Kevin Tatum. The Magnificent. They were called the Magnificent Seven.
Okay, that's the team.
I'm telling you something. I think that might have been the best team ever. But let me say this. I saw them in the first game that they played against DeMatha that year. They crushed DeMatha. They crushed them. However, over at Catholic University, James Brown was so heavily recruited. James Brown, the CBS sportscaster now, was one of the most heavily recruited basketball players in the history of college recruiting. He was recruited so much during his senior year. He could jump out the gym. He could do it all. Rebound, shoot, play defense, dribble, smart. He could do it all. One of the most heavily recruited players. He was personally recruited by Ted Kennedy. Talking about basketball players changing the world. Exactly. He was personally recruited by Ted Kennedy and ultimately went to Harvard. Well, he played on that DeMatha team that got crushed by McKinley Tech. He was exhausted, and his doctor said that do not allow him to play in some upcoming games. One of those games was against McKinley Tech that year. One of the great moments in Washington, D.C. history, although I was rooting for McKinley Tech.
Right.
James Brown's jersey was in the chair next to Morgan Wooten. James Brown was not. He was at home resting on doctor's orders. I don't think I've ever seen any team ever respond with an effort and with inspiration like that then small DeMatha team. Not nearly as good of a team physically as McKinley Tech. They came out and ran McKinley Tech out of the gym that day. I still think that McKinley Tech team is the best conglomerate of players on one team. Now, folks argue about Carroll and John Thompson and that group.
I forgot about that one. Yeah, but again, the story has it that James snuck into the gym and was up in the rafters for that game, even though he wasn't. I mean, he didn't play, obviously.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was. And we did interview Ronnie Hogue for our documentary.
Yeah, I let Hogue out.
Sure,
right,
sure.
Right.
But yeah, so we can go to the name of the documentary is actually Supreme Courts. How Washington basketball changed the world. And then what we talk about in it, not just the people who have made it to the NBA, not the people who've just made it in administration in the NBA, but there are tons of stories of people who have used the disciplines that they learned in basketball to go on, and also the scholarships that they won, to go on to other greatness. I mean, there are people who, again, going back to E.B. Henderson, he coached Charles Drew.
Yes.
He coached Duke Ellington.
Yeah.
One of the things that Charles Drew...
I don't want to just... We don't have that much time, but I don't want to just fly past those because I want my listening audience to understand why you would be so bold to call this Supreme Court, how D.C. basketball changed the world. You just mentioned Charles Drew.
Right. Sure. And also Al Gore played at St. Albans.
Right.
So these are people who, again... they not only played basketball, but they used some of those disciplines. Another person, Warren Buffett, played basketball at Wilson High School.
I was wondering if you were going to actually get to that.
Yeah,
right,
sure.
Right,
I mean, so these are people, I mean, arguably who are household names and things other than basketball, and they have used some of those disciplines in basketball. and we also definitely want to challenge other areas. You know, the Chicagos of the world. There's a great story of Wilt Chamberlain coming down here and playing against Elgin Baylor. Elgin doesn't want to talk about it. Wilt can't talk about it. But they said that, you know, you don't have cell phones and stuff, but down at Watts Playground, which is now Marvin Gaye Playground,
yes,
that people were hanging from the rafters just by understanding that these two guys were going to play. And Elgin got the best of that 7-1 guy.
Well, whether he did or not, we're going to say it because Elgin's from D.C.
Exactly.
And Wilt was from somewhere else. Exactly. And we know Wilt lied. We know Wilt lies because Wilt said he bedded 20,000 women.
Absolutely.
And I actually did a calculation
Sure.
that if he started when he was 14 years old and passed when he passed, it was something like he had to have 4 or 5 women every single day of his life, and I just don't think that happened. You lying, Will? So we're gonna say Elgin got the best one.
Absolutely.
And if Will were to dispute that, we say, well, we know he lying.
Right. Exactly.
Tell me this: what's going to be the timing of the film? When do you think you guys are going to be going to complete that?
We really want to wrap up sometime within the next 2 to 3 months, and we're going to put it out during basketball season. If we aren't able to get it out before the season starts, we definitely want to do it during the All-Star game because we're going to take it to an audience of people where we know, and it's probably better to do it during that time because I think the NBA All-Star game this year is in New Orleans, and so if we have those people, we'll have a few premieres around Washington, obviously. Because we can't just relegate, and we don't relegate it to just Washington, D.C. It's the entire metropolitan area because Earl Lloyd grew up right over in Alexandria.
Absolute legend.
The first black player to play in the NBA. There were 3 guys who were drafted that year. He was the first black to play. And then what has come of today, you look at the Kevin Durant's of the world and the Michael Beasleys, the Ty Lawsons, all of those are right there in Prince George's County. So we can't relegate it to D.C., but that's where it all started.
And this is the kind of conversation you get on the Rock Newman Show. We give the rest of the world culture from D.C. Y'all need to get that. We'll be back in just a few moments.
It's the Rock Newman Show. Rock Newman Show.